It was a chilling winter evening in Midwest City when 19-year-old Promise Cooper was rushed into the emergency room, her young body limp, her future stolen in an instant, pregnant and full of hope for a new life. Promise was barely clinging to her own. A single bullet wound to her upper chest had done irreversible damage. Despite the frantic efforts of the medical team at SSN Health Street Anthony, Promise was pronounced dead at 7:20 p.m. Her life, and the life of her unborn child, tragically cut short. But what made Promise's death even more haunting wasn't just the violence. It was the web of lies that unraveled in the hours that followed. Her boyfriend, who had driven her to the hospital in a panic, told police a terrifying story. They'd been victims of a drive-by shooting. He described a mysterious gray Dodge Charger tailing them near East Reno Avenue and Sooner Road. According to him, someone rolled down a window and fired 2 shots, one of which hit Promise in the chest. In a frantic attempt to protect them, he claimed he shot back, but wasn't sure if he hit the car. It was a story straight out of a crime thriller, but something didn't add up. Police scoured the area where the supposed shooting took place, expecting to find shell casings, shattered glass, or any evidence of a gunfight. Instead, they found nothing. No fresh bullet holes, no eyewitnesses, no frantic 911 calls from passersby, despite the area being heavily trafficked during rush hour. The only shell casing they found was old and rusted, nowhere near fresh enough to fit his timeline. And then came the most chilling revelation. Promise had called 911 herself just 44 minutes before she was shot.
Midwest City 911, is this a medical emergency?
Yes, I had somebody threatening me and going around my apartment looking for me.
Her voice trembled as she told dispatchers that her boyfriend had been harassing her, driving around the neighborhood wearing a ski mask, threatening her. But the system failed her. The call was mishandled. No officers ever made direct contact with Promise that day. She was left alone, vulnerable, and in fear. When the truth finally started to crack through her boyfriend's story, investigators realized something far more sinister had occurred. Promise wasn't the victim of a random act of violence. She was the target. And the person she needed protection from was sitting right next to her the entire time. Promise Cooper was more than just another name in a tragic headline. She was a vibrant 19-year-old with dreams that stretched far beyond the small corners of Midwest City. Described by her mother, Tia Cooper, as a ray of light.
A beautiful soul. She cared about everybody. She always gave everybody a first chance. She didn't care what color you were, religion you were. She just loved you for you.
Promise had a natural warmth that made everyone around her feel seen and valued. She had an infectious laugh, the kind that could brighten even the darkest days, and an unwavering sense of optimism, even when life wasn't easy. She had just started navigating the complicated world of adulthood when she found out she was pregnant. Though young, Promise embraced the idea of becoming a mother. She confided in her closest friends that she was scared, yes, but also excited. She dreamed of raising her child with the love and care she herself had always known. To her, this pregnancy symbolized a fresh start, a new purpose. Her family was her rock. Promise shared a deep bond with her mother, who not only supported her but served as her best friend and confidant. Taya recalled their last interaction before tragedy struck. As Promise left home that day, Tia called out after her, "I love you, Mama," the phrase they always exchanged before parting ways. It was a simple ritual, but one filled with meaning. A ritual that, heartbreakingly, would be their final exchange. Yet, not everything in Promise's life was filled with light. Her relationship with her boyfriend had grown increasingly strained, especially after revealing her pregnancy. What started as young love soon soured into a toxic, unstable connection. Her boyfriend's excitement turned into anger, resentment, and manipulation. He didn't want the baby, and Promise felt that tension daily. Despite this, Promise tried to hold on to her optimism. She confided in her mother about the difficulties but assured her that things would get better. She didn't want to believe that someone she once trusted could ever truly harm her. Even when she called 911 on the day of her death, reporting harassment and threats, there was still a part of her that hoped things wouldn't escalate. Promise's life was filled with dreams and plans for the future, plans that were ripped away in an instant. She never got the chance to hold her baby, to hear that first cry, or to build the life she so desperately wanted. Her story is not just about how she died, but about who she was. A young woman full of love, light, and hope for a future that was stolen too soon. At first glance, Promise Cooper's boyfriend seemed like a typical 22-year-old, a young man trying to find his place in the world. But beneath the surface, there were cracks, warning signs that, in hindsight, foreshadowed a dangerous descent into manipulation and control. Promise met him during a time when she was seeking stability, someone who could be a partner as she navigated young adulthood. Their relationship began like many others, filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and promises of a future together. For a while, things seemed hopeful. He made her feel special, appreciated, and most importantly, seen. But things shifted the moment Promise revealed she was pregnant. The initial excitement that Promise had hoped for never came. Instead, she was met with denial, anger, and a cold wall of resentment. Friends later revealed that Promise confided in them about the growing tension. Her boyfriend didn't want the baby. He began pushing for an abortion, insisting that they weren't ready and that it would ruin their lives. But Promise had made up her mind. She wanted to keep the child. It was around this time that his behavior grew darker and more erratic. Arguments became frequent. He started isolating Promise from her friends, accusing her of not caring about him or their relationship. Emotional manipulation became his primary weapon, using guilt and threats to control her. One of the most chilling incidents occurred just hours before her death. Promise called 911, terrified, as he circled her apartment complex wearing a ski mask, threatening her. It was a clear escalation, a sign that things had gone far beyond verbal arguments. When police arrived, a tragic miscommunication occurred. Due to a clerical error, the 911 dispatcher entered the wrong name into the call notes, leading officers to question Promise's mother without realizing the gravity of the situation. This critical mistake meant that Promise was left unprotected, despite reaching out for help. Despite everything, Promise still got into the car with him later that day. Whether it was fear, hope for reconciliation, or simply feeling she had no choice, we may never know. What we do know is that in that car, driving through Midwest City, Promise sat beside someone who had once promised to love and protect her, but who had now become her greatest threat. The signs were there. The warnings were loud. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, the system failed her at the most critical moment. As Promise Cooper's relationship spiraled into darkness, the warning signs became more glaring, each one a haunting prelude to the tragedy that was about to unfold. In the weeks leading up to her death, Promise confided in close friends and family about the growing strain between her and her boyfriend. Arguments had become a daily occurrence, often centered around her pregnancy. What should have been a time filled with excitement and preparation instead became a battleground of conflicting emotions. He pressured her relentlessly to terminate the pregnancy, insisting that neither of them was ready for parenthood. But Promise stood firm in her decision. She wanted to keep the baby. The emotional abuse deepened. Text messages between the two revealed heated arguments, filled with manipulative tactics. He would alternate between guilt-tripping her and issuing subtle threats. While there were no explicit messages threatening her life, there was a chilling undercurrent of control. Phrases like "you'll regret this" and "you're ruining everything" painted a disturbing picture of his state of mind. Promise's demeanor changed as the tension escalated. Family members noticed she had become more withdrawn. She wasn't her usual bubbly self. Her once frequent social media posts became sporadic, and when she did post, they lacked the energy and happiness she once radiated. Friends who visited her said she seemed anxious, often checking over her shoulder or glancing out the window as if expecting someone. The clearest cry for help came on the day of her death. At 5:11 p.m., Promise dialed 911, her voice trembling with fear. She reported that her boyfriend was driving around her apartment complex, wearing a ski mask and threatening her. The image alone is terrifying. A young, pregnant woman trapped inside her home, watching as the person she once trusted circled her, now masked and menacing. She told the dispatcher she couldn't see him anymore, but would call back if he returned. That call should have been the lifeline that saved her. But a clerical error would cost Promise her chance at safety. The dispatcher mistakenly entered the wrong name into the call notes. When an officer arrived at her residence, they spoke to Promise's mother, but due to the mix-up, didn't make proper contact regarding the threat. The system failed her.
4 minutes could have been enough time to save my daughter. She walked out the door and I was like, I love you, Mama, because I always tell my kids that before they leave.
Minutes ticked by. Her boyfriend called her repeatedly after the 911 call, and though Promise initially avoided answering, she eventually did. Whether it was out of fear, coercion, or a desperate hope to de-escalate the situation, she agreed to meet him. That decision would prove fatal. The cracks in their relationship, the emotional manipulation, the escalating threats, all of it built up to that final car ride, where Promise sat next to the man who had become both her tormentor and, ultimately, her killer. She had asked for help. She had sent out warnings. But in the end, those warnings went unheard, leading to a tragedy that could have, and should have, been prevented. January 9, 2024 was supposed to be just another evening in Midwest City, but for Promise Cooper, it became the final chapter of her young life, marked by fear, betrayal, and a single fatal gunshot. After calling 911 and reporting her boyfriend's harassment, Promise might have hoped that her cries for help would bring someone to her door. But when no officers arrived in time, she made a choice that would seal her fate. She got into the car with him. Whether out of fear, manipulation, or a desperate attempt to calm the situation, that decision led her directly into the path of danger. They drove around the city in his black 2016 Chevy Trax SUV, a tense and heavy silence likely filling the space between them. The boyfriend later claimed they stopped briefly at his mother's house, but they didn't go inside. Instead, they kept driving, making their way toward East Reno Avenue and Sooner Road. It was there, he would later tell police, that things took a dark and violent turn. His initial story to detectives painted a chaotic scene. He claimed they were followed by a suspicious gray Dodge Charger, a car he believed was after him. According to him, as they pulled up near the intersection, the Charger rolled down its window, and shots were fired at their vehicle. In a panic, he pulled out his semi-automatic pistol and fired 2 shots in return, trying to defend them. But the holes in his story quickly became apparent. When police canvassed the area, they found no evidence of a shooting. No shell casings, no fresh bullet holes, and no witnesses who reported hearing gunfire in what was usually a busy area during rush hour. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses didn't show the Dodge Charger or even Promise and her boyfriend's SUV during the time of the alleged shooting. It was becoming clear that his story was falling apart. The most damning evidence came from inside the SUV. Forensic teams found a single spent shell casing on the driver's side floorboard. There were no bullet holes in the vehicle, inside or out, contradicting his claims of an external shooting. The trajectory of the bullet that struck Promise, hitting her in the upper right chest, suggested it was fired from within the car. After hours of questioning, the pressure became too much. Just after 2:30 a.m., her boyfriend's story finally began to crack. He admitted to detectives that much of his earlier statement was fabricated. There was no Dodge Charger, no drive-by shooting. He confessed that he had been paranoid, possibly due to PTSD, and believed someone was following them. He claimed that, in a moment of fear, he pulled out his pistol and fired a shot out the passenger window, over Promise's head. When she panicked and tried to grab the gun, he fired again. That second shot was the one that hit her. He called it an accident, a tragic mistake. But the evidence told a different story, one of escalating threats, emotional manipulation, and a young woman who had tried to escape a toxic and dangerous relationship. Promise was rushed to SSM Health Street.
An affidavit details the two approaching the intersection of Reno and Sooner. Stoner claimed a person in a Dodge Charger was being suspicious, shooting at the vehicle, hitting Cooper in the chest. Stoner taking
her unborn child was pronounced dead. Her boyfriend's carefully constructed web of lies had unraveled. What started as a desperate attempt to cover up the truth had now fully exposed the horrifying reality. Promise hadn't been killed by a random act of violence. She had been murdered by the very person she trusted most. From the moment Promise Cooper was pronounced dead, investigators knew something about her boyfriend's story didn't sit right. The conflicting details, the lack of physical evidence at the supposed crime scene, and the haunting 911 call placed just 44 minutes before her death, all pointed to one chilling truth. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was something far more calculated. The investigation began at the scene where Promise's boyfriend claimed the shooting had taken place, near East Reno Avenue and Sooner Road. Officers scoured the area for evidence of the supposed drive-by shooting, but found nothing that matched his description. No fresh shell casings, no shattered glass, no stray bullets. Even though it was rush hour, not a single 911 call came in reporting gunfire. This lack of physical evidence raised immediate red flags. Attention quickly turned to the boyfriend's black 2016 Chevy Trax SUV, which had transported Promise to the hospital. Forensic experts meticulously examined the vehicle, looking for signs that would corroborate his story. What they found told a different narrative. Inside the SUV, investigators discovered a spent shell casing on the driver's side floorboard. An odd location if shots had been fired from outside the vehicle. There were no bullet holes in the car's exterior, no shattered windows, and no marks suggesting gunfire from another vehicle. The positioning of the shell casing and the bullet trajectory revealed a grim reality. The shot that killed Promise was fired from inside the car, not from an external threat. Police also recovered the boyfriend's semi-automatic pistol from the SUV, along with 2 cell phones. A search of his phone unveiled a disturbing digital trail, text messages filled with arguments and emotional manipulation. In the days leading up to the shooting, the couple had exchanged heated messages about Promise's pregnancy. He had pressured her to get an abortion, expressing resentment and anger over her decision to keep the baby. While none of the messages contained explicit threats of violence, they painted a clear picture of escalating emotional abuse. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence was Promise's 911 call made at 5:11 p.m., just 44 minutes before she was fatally shot. In the call, her voice trembled as she described her boyfriend driving around her apartment complex in a ski mask, threatening her. She was scared, alone, and desperate for help. But due to a clerical error, the dispatcher entered the wrong name into the call notes, leading responding officers to mistakenly believe they were dealing with a different individual. This critical mistake meant no officers made direct contact with Promise, leaving her vulnerable to the very danger she was trying to escape. As the boyfriend's initial story unraveled, detectives brought him back in for questioning. Faced with mounting evidence, his composure began to crack. At first, he stuck to his narrative about the Dodge Charger and the supposed shootout. But as detectives presented him with forensic findings that contradicted his claims, he finally broke down. In a tearful confession, he admitted that much of his story had been fabricated. There was no Dodge Charger, no random shooter. He confessed that, gripped by paranoia, he fired his pistol inside the car, claiming he believed they were in danger. When Promise tried to grab the gun from him, a second shot went off, striking her in the chest. He called it an accident, but investigators weren't convinced. The preponderance of evidence, conflicting stories, emotional manipulation, the 911 call, and the forensic findings painted a clear and damning picture. This was not a simple accident. It was the culmination of weeks of emotional abuse, threats, and control that ultimately ended in Promise's death. Armed with this evidence, investigators arrested him on charges of second-degree murder, ensuring that he would no longer be able to spin his web of lies. Following the damning evidence and his conflicting statements, Promise Cooper's 22-year-old boyfriend was arrested and booked into the Oklahoma County Jail on a charge of second-degree murder. His initial claim of a drive-by shooting had crumbled under scrutiny, replaced by a partial confession, admitting he fired the fatal shot, but calling it an accident. During the first court hearing, prosecutors presented a clear timeline: the emotional manipulation, the heated arguments over Promise's pregnancy, and the tragic 911 call made just 44 minutes before her death. They argued that his actions weren't just reckless, but part of a pattern of escalating control and threats. The defense insisted the shooting was unintentional, citing paranoia and poor judgment. But the judge, citing the severity of the crime and risk to public safety, denied bail, ensuring the boyfriend would remain in custody while the case proceeded. Promise's family sat through every moment in court, devastated but determined. Her mother, Tia Cooper, expressed her heartbreak outside the courthouse, saying, "He took my baby and my grandbaby from me. We won't stop until there's justice."
It really messes me up because my baby was pregnant, and that is the whole reason why he did it. He got what he wanted. Now I want what I want, and I want justice.
As the legal battle unfolded, prosecutors hinted at the possibility of elevating charges, arguing that the emotional abuse and prior threats could point to premeditation, not just a tragic mistake. Promise Cooper's death left a deep scar on her family, friends, and the entire Midwest City community. For her mother, Tia Cooper, the loss was almost unbearable. A daughter stolen from her, along with the unborn grandchild she had been so excited to meet. Tia often spoke of the emptiness left behind, saying, "It really messes me up because my baby was pregnant, and that's the whole reason why he did it. Now, I want justice." Promise's family wasn't just grieving. They were also grappling with the haunting reality that her death might have been prevented. The mishandled 911 call, where Promise cried out for help just 44 minutes before being shot, became a painful symbol of systemic failure. Tia openly voiced her frustration, saying, "That 44 minutes could have been enough time to save my daughter." The community responded with an outpouring of support. Vigils were held in Promise's memory, where candles flickered against the night sky as loved ones and strangers alike gathered to honor her life. Many brought flowers and notes, expressing sorrow for the life cut short and outrage over the circumstances that led to her death. Promise's story also sparked deeper conversations about domestic violence and the importance of recognizing emotional abuse as a precursor to physical harm. Advocacy groups began pushing for reforms in 911 response protocols, highlighting how critical errors, like the one in Promise's case, can have devastating consequences. For Promise's family, the pain is ongoing, but so is their fight for justice. Her mother continues to speak out, determined to ensure that Promise's story isn't forgotten, and that no other family has to endure the same heartbreak. "My baby was light in this world," Tia said through tears. "I lost her, but I'll make sure her voice is still heard."